Coming past the 8th pole, it's Ruffian in front by 7 lengths. Something Regal on the outside, second point in time. The other's now far back as Ruffian draws away to lead by 9. It's Ruffian in front and going easily.
Hello, it's Bob Pandolfo, and it's Wednesday, November 15th, 2023. Welcome to Power Pace with Pandy, and I just want to talk a little bit about the Horse Racing Integrity Act, the HISA or HISA, Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act, that you may have seen. If you didn't, I could put a link underneath this video, but there was a 60 minutes special on, segment this past weekend, Sunday, where they talked about, some of the problems in horse racing and the trainers who were, convicted of drugging their horses that broke down, and they talked about HISA, the Integrity and Safety Act for horse racing, that was approved a couple of years ago in Congress. So some of you may have read this article I wrote back in the fall of 2020. I called it Tainted Feed. It was after Bob Baffert had won the Kentucky Derby with Authentic, and that was in the fall that year because that was the COVID year. So that was in November. And basically I wrote a negative piece about Bob Baffert, and then in the spring he had 5 more. From that time, from the Derby on, from November of 2020 until the following year, the Kentucky Derby in May, he had 5 more drug violations, and he was banned from racing in the Triple Crown races. He still can't race in Kentucky, and he was banned in New York for a while, but now he can race there. So, I'm pretty much a small government person. My ideology, I think we need the government to protect us from evil, but otherwise, they should get out of our way. But I have to admit that in this article, I did say, we probably need this bill, the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act, because thoroughbred racing and harness racing actually have done, over the years, have done a terrible job at policing themselves. And this was a great example with this trainer, Bob Baffert. And now I want to make something clear. When I wrote this, I didn't write this because of Baffert's drug violations. I mean, he had a lot of drug violations, mainly overages for legal substances, where a horse had a little bit too much in his, in his post drug test. In other words, after the race, when the drug test came back, it showed that there was a drug in there and there was a little bit too much of it. That's not the reason why I wrote this. The tipping point were the way, some of the things that happened, in his career and the way it was handled by the California Horse Racing Board, the CHRB. And there were a couple things in particular. One of them was the horses that had died in his care. In this article, I'm not going to go into everything, but there were 7 horses that died in a 16-month period from November of 2011 through March of 2013. 7 horses trained by Bob Baffert in Southern California dropped dead. They dropped dead from either cardiac arrest or aneurysms. Basically, their heart burst. And as I say here, Baffert's horses accounted for 2.5% of the starts in California during that time period, but 19.4% of the deaths. And these weren't horses that broke down; they just dropped dead. So what happened was, they naturally, when I saw this, I was like, oh, they're going to investigate this. They're probably going to fine Baffert or suspend him. But they cleared him. They just said, no, we couldn't find anything wrongdoing, and they didn't even fine him. Nothing. And this was wrong. I mean, this was clearly wrong. Now Baffert had said that he was giving his horses, here it is, a thyroid medication called thyroxine. Basically, it's a thyroid medicine. He said to build them up. And he was giving it to all his horses, right? Rick Arthur, who was on the board, who was a longtime veterinarian, like had been in the business, 30 years or so, he called Baffert's statement surprising because he said this drug is usually used for the opposite, to assist weight loss, right? So the thing is, and I go into detail, I don't want to go and, have such a long video, but you can read it here, but I go into some detail about this particular drug, which has been abused by trainers for many years. And I, I talk to people in the industry, including, people that run racetracks, and they told me how this drug, has been used. And you can see here that PETA, the group that looks out for the safety of animals, they investigated some of the leading trainers, and they found that this drug was being abused, and that it conveniently speeds up metabolism, and is widely used. And this was the same drug that Baffert said he used. Now, another thing is that someone, again, prominent in the racing industry, told me that it can be used as a masking agent to mitigate the effects of cobalt chloride, which is a banned performance-enhancing substance. So there's a lot to this. All right, and by the way, Rick Arthur was almost thrown off the board for saying this. They tried to get him off the board. They didn't like that he said, I'm surprised that Baffert said this. Now, I want to stress something. For the California, Horse Racing Board, the CHRB, to not fine or suspend Baffert at all after 7 of his horses died, and he admitted that he gave him this drug, is, as far as I'm concerned, is corruption. That's my opinion. I don't. You can call it the complicity, you can call it corruption, but I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, you got to be kidding me. These are young horses. Horses don't just drop dead when they're like 2 or 3 years old. And this was 7 in 16 months. So obviously this was neglect or some sort of, incompetence or, on the part of Baffert and his veterinarian. Whatever was going on there. And now, of course, with Baffert, we don't even know if he was telling the truth, if he actually gave him this drug. Who the heck knows what he gave him? We know that he's a bullshit artist, basically. And he says all kinds of crazy things when his horse tests positive for drugs. I mean, he comes up with the most flimsy, bizarre explanations and excuses. But that, when I saw that, I was like, wow, that was a red flag for me. And then, of course, the other red flag, and this is another reason why I wrote this article, was when Justify tested positive. Justify was a horse that raced 6 times for Baffert, won all 6 races, including the Kentucky Derby and the Triple Crown, and then he was retired and syndicated for, I think I have it in here somewhere, $60 million. But he tested positive after he finished first in the Santa Anita Derby, and Baffert and the California Horse Racing Board, again, the CHRB, didn't tell anybody about it, right? You can't do that. That's corruption. So we wouldn't have even known about it, that the horse tested positive. But Joe Drape, sports writer for the New York Times, broke the story after the horse had been retired. This is a year later. And I guess somebody leaked it to him. And that's how we found out. So, and actually the California Horse Racing Board, made up some sort of flimsy excuse, it was a contamination or something like that, but it doesn't make any difference. If the horse tested positive, he wouldn't have qualified for the Derby, because he could have been disqualified from the Santa Anita Derby, which would have meant he might not have been able to run in the Kentucky Derby. And as it was, they hit it, he won the Derby, he won all 6 races of his career, syndicated for $60 million. That was corruption. So between that and this whole thing about the thyroid drug and the 7 dead horses, that's why I wrote this. And a lot of people, read it. It was published on a few different horse racing websites. It was sent to Congress by someone I know who works for the White House. And a lot of people were shocked, because people that don't follow horse racing that closely, and millions of people follow horse racing, but they watch the Kentucky Derby, they watch maybe the Breeders' Cup, they go to the track once in a while. They wouldn't know all these things, And of course, the industry tried to hide all this stuff because Baffert is, such a celebrity. And he's a Hall of Fame trainer. I mean, he's had a tremendously successful career, probably the most successful trainer in history. The only one who really can match him is Todd Pletcher, but the thing is, Baffert has twice as many Breeders' Cups wins as Pletcher. He did when I wrote this anyway. And he also had twice as many Triple Crown winners as Pletcher. But Pletcher doesn't have, all these other, negatives I mean, Pletcher has a few drug violations, but not like this. I mean, Baffert, when I wrote this, Baffert was in the top 3 in the sport in total drug violations. I think it was 32 at that time. Now it's like 37, I believe. And he also had one of the top 3 in the sport for drug violations per start. So, even though I don't like having government, into every part of our lives, the racing industry, you can't let people get away with this. And in if this guy was cheating, training, Bob Baffert, he was cheating at a level, at a high level in the richest races and the most prestigious races, like the Kentucky Derby. And like I said, as we know, when he got those 5 suspensions, several months after I wrote this article, his horse finished first in the Kentucky Derby and was disqualified because he tested for, positive for drugs. Then that horse, by the way, is dead now. He died within a year after he finished first in the Kentucky Derby. He dropped dead. So, going back to HISA, all right, they wouldn't allow this to happen. They're not going to allow this to happen. Like, for instance, he claims he gave these horses that died, this thyroid drug, right? You got to remember that this was gross negligence on his part, because these horses didn't have a thyroid problem. If you went to the doctor and he said to you, I'm going to put you on this thyroid drug, and you would say, why? Do I have a thyroid problem? Is something wrong with my thyroid? And say the doctor said, no, your thyroid's fine, but he said, I kind of like this drug. I think it might give you a little pickup. All right, you probably, I would imagine, would try and find another doctor. I mean, that would be, malpractice. Right? You can't give somebody a drug. You can't prescribe a drug to someone that they don't need. That's malpractice. But this is what they do with horses, and this is one of the things that HISA is going to stop. Like, if this happened now, HISA would go to the trainer and say, why did you give him this drug? Now, there's one thing I never could find out. And unfortunately, again, this is another reason why HISA is necessary. You don't get all the information. So I never found out when the CHRB did their investigation of these dead horses, were there documented veterinarian reports. I mean, you can't give a horse a thyroid drug unless the veterinarian approves it, right? The veterinarian has to sign off on it, and he gives the horse the drug, right? So, and I couldn't find this information. I mean, I would assume that when they did their investigation, the California Horseracing Board must have went to the Baffert's veterinarian and said, why did you approve this drug? Why did you give this horse these drugs? They didn't have a thyroid problem. My guess is the reason why the CHRB didn't disclose that information because they didn't want people to know, because obviously some of these veterinarians are, they'll just, all they're interested in is getting paid. They don't care about the horse. So these horses that died, that wasn't just Baffert's fault. That's also the veterinarian's fault, and the CHRB, unfortunately, let him get away with it. Now, the only thing else I want to mention about this is that, I've been told by many people that the CHRB now is better. In other words, these people that were on the board then have been replaced. It's a different group now. I do think they are going to be tougher, but something, it's not really going to make any difference because HISA, this organization that was approved by Congress, they're not going to let this happen. They control the medications now. So, some of these, the way it used to work, every state would have like certain limits. Say, if you use this particular drug, it can't be over this much in the blood, for instance, the amount in the bloodstream after they test. But every state was different. Every jurisdiction was different. HISA is making it so all of the tracks that have the same medication rules. All right, so it's consistent throughout the sport. And that's what you want. You want some sort of continuity. And like I said, they're not going to let these trainers, give horses drugs that they don't need. They've already suspended, I think it's 30 or 32 trainers in the first year that they've been active. And look, they have some things they have to clean up. They're putting this together. We just have to hope it works because, like I said, these sports did not police themselves. Now, this show that was on 60 Minutes the other night, talked about the trainers that they didn't talk so much about the trainers that were suspended. They mentioned it, but they talked about the trainers that actually are going to jail, the ones that were caught in the sting operation in New Jersey a couple of years ago. Some are getting, some thoroughbred trainers and harness racing trainers are getting 4 or 5 years. Something like that. Some veterinarians and some people that sell these illegal drugs. I don't want to go into too much into that. It's just you can read about it. They mentioned it, some of it on the 60 Minutes segment. But I just wanted to mention why I approved of HISA in the first place. Why I felt it was needed. It had a lot to do with this kind of shenanigans that were going on, on the West Coast. When I wrote this, I sent it to all the major racing jurisdictions, and I said to them, you might want to read this, something I wrote. I have a lot of information in here that I gleaned from different reports, different articles, Washington Post, New York Times, and I said, maybe when this trainer brings his horses in for these major stakes races, at the very least, you should keep them under surveillance. Put them in a detention barn, And as it turns out, as we know, Bob Baffert cannot run horses right now in the state of Kentucky, and he cannot run in the Kentucky Derby. The Kentucky Derby, by the way, I don't know how many people realize this, but Churchill Downs is a corporation. The Kentucky Derby is a big thing, not only for the sport, but for Churchill Downs. Now, the only sporting event that's watched more than the Kentucky Derby is the Super Bowl. I mean, this is a huge event. They charge a lot of money. My son just got tickets with some friends of his. It's my son and his wife. They're going to go in 2024, and I think the tickets were $750 a person, I believe, for 2 days. For Friday and Saturday if you want to go see the Oaks, and that includes seats and food comps and things. Food is included and things like that. And there's probably packages that are more. You can get, you're talking about between the television revenue and what they bring in with this huge crowd, which is 140, 150,000 people attend. I mean, this is a big moneymaker for Churchill Downs Incorporated. And I don't even know if it's called Churchill Downs. Is it Twin Spire? Whatever it's called, that corporation. This is something that brings in a tremendous amount of money, tremendous amount of exposure for them. I mean, if they screw up the Kentucky Derby, not only could it damage their company, of course, it could have tremendous damage to the sport. So when Baffert's horse tested positive, in 2021, that was only the second horse in the history of the sport that had come up with a positive test after the Kentucky Derby. And then this year in 2023, they had some problems. They had horses breaking down the whole week of the Kentucky Derby, and then after the race, they ended up racing the rest of the meet at Ellis Park. So again, that was tricky. They know, Churchill Downs know, they have to be really careful. This is an integral part of the racing product is the Triple Crown, and especially the Kentucky Derby, which is one of the largest spectacles in professional sports. So anyway, my main reason for talking about, making this video was to show why I supported HISA in the first place and why I wrote this article. It wasn't, about his 32 or 37, drug violations, but at the time I wrote this, it was 32. It was about the way the CHRB had covered up the justified, drug positive and had not fined him when he gave these, he claims he gave these horses who died this, thyroid drug, which in itself is a controversial drug. Anyway, make sure you subscribe to my channel. It's free, and lots of luck. I'll have more videos, on thoroughbred racing and harness racing.